Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer fantasy lore. Where today we're going to talk about another of the navies of the old world. One that at first flush might seem to have a lot in common with the Bretonnian navy we covered earlier, but actually, no, not at all. The navy of the Empire. The second and grandest of all the human empires in the old world, whom, despite their significantly greater size than Bretonnia, has never really bothered doing much with its navy. In part due to the fact that whilst Bretonnia, of course, has a long and complex coastline, which brings about countless advantages like access to trade and fishing, for example, also brings about certain problems, like huge quantities of Norscan raiders trying to steal the peasantry away from their rightful lieges. Meanwhile, the Empire's access to the sea is comparatively limited, with only 2 elector provinces bordering the Sea of Claws. Those provinces, of course, being Nordland and Ostland. These 2 provinces usually have far more pressing things to worry about than the construction of a navy. Beyond simple coastal defense forces, that is anyways, as the Empire has no great tradition of seaborne exploration or even large-scale seaborne trade. In part because the Sea of Claws got its name for a very good reason, and because the primary naval port of the Empire for the majority of its existence was obviously the port city of Marienburg. But, as we covered in a previous video talking about the history of Marienburg, once that city seceded from the Empire, it took with it all of the shipbuilding knowledge required to build great ocean-going vessels, as well as the skilled craftsmen required to construct them, and all of the facilities in which those skilled craftsmen worked. As building something as enormous as an Empire Greatship requires specialized facilities, not just the dry docks in which they are constructed, but cranes with which they can be loaded, and, of course, specialized storage facilities to keep the ship-grade timber nice and dry. Not to mention access to these resources to begin with. Making sails of the kind of shape, enormity, and durability required to propel a great ship isn't something that your average cottage industry is capable of producing. And so, with the departure of Marienburg, a great amount of the Imperial Navy simply just disappeared virtually overnight. Which, frankly, wasn't even that new of an experience to the Imperial Navy, as it has had a rather tumultuous history. Getting destroyed, getting broken up into bits and pieces, being reformed, being split up between the various elector counts, being formed into one fleet or another, and so on and so on. As to the Empire, the Navy is more of a Band-Aid solution, rather than so much the permanent institution that it is within Bretonnia. And true to this history, of course, the Navy was created, well, as a necessary expediency. For you see, during the dawning days of the Empire, when the various human tribes were all coalescing under the command of Sigmar and his various successors, of course, it soon became clear that they weren't the only humans around. And many of the other humans were extraordinarily hostile, seemingly intent solely on taking all of the nice, fertile, rich land of the Empire for themselves. These aggressive foreigners were referred to under the common sobriquet of Norscans. Of course, the Norscans themselves would have argued that they were actually a wide variety of tribes, coming from a land almost the size of the Empire itself, but, well, the cultural topic rarely arose mid-coastal raid. Regardless of their precise origins, however, the burgeoning empire was growing quite tired of the raping and the pillaging, and moved therefore to try and reduce it somewhat, beginning with mounting small-scale river fleets. As many times the Norscan raiders would not strike at the isolated coastal settlements, but rather travel down the long winding path of the River Reich and its countless tributary and side rivers to strike deeper within the civilized center, or well, the sort of civilized center anyways, of the then tribal society of the empire. Those early nobles and tribal chieftains that dedicated the resources required to build fleets were better able to withstand the predations of the Northmen. This in turn meant that this solution grew in popularity until it was made into a literal imperial decree from Sigmar's successors that every coastal noble must maintain a small flotilla of rivercraft capable of protecting their domains from the Norscans. And with the eventual incorporations of what was then known as the Westerlands, today the areas around Marienburg, the burgeoning empire got access to the sea, along with several other resources necessary for shipbuilding, and a much larger scale general endeavor could be committed to. Now, not only would there be small coastal patrol crafts, but larger vessels would also be constructed. These would primarily be used as transports, carrying large numbers of soldiers up and down the River Reich to counteract any Norscan raids. Eventually, the access to the River Reich itself would also be contested by an ever-growing imperial navy, attempting to block and thwart the raids before they had even begun. This was indeed quite successful in sparing the deeper empire from the predations of the raiders, but it did also lead to the very first sacking of Marienburg. Poor little coastal city that was to be sacked many more times. And in response to the sacking, the emperor at the time declared the creation of an official position whose responsibility it was to maintain the empire's navy and to protect its coasts from invasion. This grand undertaking would both include, of course, the construction of an ever greater and more ambitious navy, alongside further river patrol crafts and transports to be used on the River Reich. But it also included the construction of several wooden fortresses up and down the coast of the empire, to provide rapid response garrisons that could sally out against any raiders, and also potentially protect any other entrances to the Imperium's interior. Furthermore, of course, Marienburg itself would also be further fortified, making it a significantly more daunting prospect for casual Norscan raids. So successful was this building and preparatory program that it did indeed bring a complete halt to Norscan activity against the Empire's coastal waters. For several hundred years, in fact, an uneasy peace ruled between the Norscans and the various tribes and the Empire. Probably buffeted up by some tribute here and there, but the cost was vastly preferable to the damaging and all too frequent raids upon the coastline. However, of course, as with any peace gained through strength, once that strength eventually wanes, and it will, once the forces of the Empire believe that they no longer need all of the defenses or the expensive fleets to defend themselves, then all of these things will eventually be allowed to slowly rot away and return to a state of uselessness, leading some 300-odd years later to the second sacking of Marienburg. Like I said, it's a somewhat unfortunate city. But this particular piece of bad luck would actually turn out to be a blessing in disguise, as this time the Norscans had come to stay. with huge numbers of northerners beginning to settle in what was then the Westerlands and Ostland and Nordland. These came as invaders, but because the Empire was busy with one of its literally countless civil wars, not that much in the way of an effort to actually get rid of them was launched. Now, this might have been a problem if they had come as chaos marauders bent upon the destruction of the Empire, but much like the Empire itself was nowhere near the power it is today, nor were the Norscan raiders quite so unified in purpose. And many of those who arrived, deciding to not venture further into the depths of the Empire out of fear of getting caught in between various warring civil conflict armies, and because the deeper waterways were still heavily patrolled by river barges and naval patrols, they instead began to settle down in the, by comparison to Norska, rich and fertile lands that they had occupied. Turns out they really enjoyed this sort of living. It was nice, soft, and with plentiful food. And the trade was good too. For once, the ocean was more than just claws and blood and sudden death, occasionally rewarded with a successful raid, from which the raiders could then live for a few months before needing to venture out yet again from the cold and desolate northern lands of Norska. Here in the Empire, life was pretty gosh darn good. And many of them, in fact, found the local religions too particularly appealing, such as the worship of Ulrich or Sigmar. Thus, many of the raiders became settlers and eventually converts to the Sigmarite or Ulrich faith. And due to the ongoing civil war within the Empire, which would only grow larger, incidentally, there were countless barons, counts, and nobles that were all too happy to receive the Norskans into their employ and learn from their shipbuilding arts, in order to further their own goals within the Empire, of course. And with the official seal of approval of literal Emperor and the occasional empress as well, the Norskans quite quickly integrated into imperial society because their skills were highly valued, both as soldiers and raiders and as expert shipbuilders. As several of the powers at the time, chief amongst them forces like Ostland, Midland, and Reichland, saw great advantage in being able to build their own effective, shallow draft warships, resulting in some of the earliest iterations of the Empire's wolf ships. These are sizable, oared galleons, designed initially primarily for ramming actions. They were more than capable of traveling up the River Reich and could also deploy longboats to patrol up and down the countless tributaries and side rivers, while also being a primary force to be feared by pretty much any adversary they ran into. These would eventually be further enhanced by the additions of cannons and so on, but that was much later so still. This granted several of the Elector states de facto and damn near uncontested control over the riverways of the Empire. This not only allowed them to transport their own troops in safety and far quicker than marching across land, but it also gave them access to trade, both within the Empire and with groupings and nations outside of the Empire. There started quite the naval arms race inside of the nation, with those who did not have access to skilled shipbuilders instead constructing fortresses and fortified bridges across the river. These served both as toll booths in the occasional, albeit rarer, peaceful times, during the endless civil wars yet again, not to mention invasions by other foreign powers or those from underground, as many of these fortifications later served a valuable purpose in limiting the spread of infested river cargo during the plague. But these were still primarily river-going navies, with the only true nation-going power being possessed, as usual, by Marienburg, who used its navy to continue its powerful position within the empire and beyond its borders as one of the chief, and damn near only, major trading ports in the empire. And it was going to need its navy as well, both to keep the other competing powers in check within the empire, and because it was yet again sacked for a third time, although this time by the High Elves, before eventually also gaining its de facto independence in the early portions of 2300, after the Great War against Chaos, of course. It was also that great war that finally began to see the Empire start to stabilize a little bit again, with a more unified overarching structure and centralized points of power, with Altdorf emerging as the sole uncontested winner, in essence, of the countless civil wars. This then eventually led to the official splitting of the Imperial Navy into two separate forces, the Northern and the Southern Fleet. The Northern Fleet would be the proper ocean-going fleet, that operating in the Sea of Claws, and the Southern Fleet would be the river barges and the river patrols, which would run up and down the River Reich and its tributaries, protecting the internal regions of the Empire. This arrangement was made somewhat more complicated by the secession of Marienburg, of course, as now the merchants of Marienburg decided to place a heavy tithe on any imperial vessels that chose to pass past it and into the Sea of Claws. Not that this happened very often either way, as the Southern Fleet was obviously far more focused on river patrol duties, and would be ill-suited to operate in the northern waters of the Sea of Claws. But it did also split this originally primarily administrative difference into two very clear-cut differences. As previously, it would have been entirely possible for the Imperial Navy to station many of its larger warships near Altdorf, deep inside of the Empire, in profoundly safe harbours. Now they have to keep them in significantly more risky berthings near the coast facing the Sea of Claws. This also means that the Northern Navy, often also referred to as the Second Navy, amusingly enough, is by far the more professional and effective of the two. It also has tended to be the most modern of the two as well, being the first to take into usage cannons, for example. These loud and gargantuan weapons were originally imported into the Empire by Chilean traders, and quickly proved extraordinarily effective, to the point where there was even a brief ban on their use on the riverways of the Empire. But as the Civil War period eventually began to calm down, that ban swiftly disappeared as well, as turning cannons upon foreigners was of course no problem whatsoever. The Northern Fleet then operates out of Nordland, and more specifically the port of Editheshafen as its primary port of operations. Its main duty is to protect the vast coastal regions of the Empire and engage Norscan raiders. This is significantly more difficult than engaging the occasional smuggler deep within the Empire, as the Norscans themselves are no slouches at naval warfare. The stakes are also significantly higher for the Navy of Nordland, as they are protecting their own homes from literal invasion rather than tax-dodging scoundrels. And there are significantly more dangerous things out to sea than just Norscan raiders too, even though they're bad enough. Occasionally the Northern Fleet finds itself forced to engage both occasional monsters, which can be a problem in and of themselves due to often being able to go underwater, which is very unfortunate, or perhaps even worse still, dark elf slaver fleets. Now, the regular warships are one thing. They are swift, maneuverable, and piloted by extraordinarily skilled crews, but at least they only boast things like small cannons or more often ballistas. These are regular warships, even if they are very, very good ones. A far worse threat, however, is the appearance of a black arc along the coast, as these literal sea-going fortresses are, well, practically impossible to deal with. The best thing the Northern Navy can do most of the time is harry and harass them, trying to make it complicated for them to land anywhere or making it difficult for them to deploy their raiding fleets to harass the coast itself. A direct engagement is virtually impossible. Although the innovative and progressive Northern Fleet has created a handful of fascinating vessels intended to engage just such threats or other equivalent large-scale dangers. One of them is the Iron Fist boat. This is a large war galley, built to be significantly wider than their usual river-faring equivalents, because it carries a tremendous bronze mortar. These are obviously not very good seafaring vessels, as their center of gravity is somewhat screwed up, but operating in coastal regions with calm waters, they are not only an enormous threat to enemy landing parties, beached boats readying to take aboard, or dispatched raiders, or even enemy settlements, small temporary fortresses raised on the coastline, a favorite tactic of the Norskins, and occasionally also green-skinned raiders. As the Iron Fists carry mortars significantly heavier than that found in most land armies, they can be brought to bear both quickly and effectively against any temporary fortifications. And whilst their usage in massed naval battles is somewhat dubious, the elevated trajectory of their shots, of course, means that they are capable of laying down fire straight over intervening Allied vessels, even if actually hitting anything at that point is, well, almost as much luck as skill, as the only real way the gunners have to adjust the trajectory of the weapon is lessening or increasing the quantity of gunpowder. An imprecise science, as I'm sure you'll understand. Another weapon, more focused on direct naval confrontations, and a very recent entry to the Empire's navy, is the Hell Hammer. This monstrosity was brought into service under the direct supervision of the Emperor Karl Franz himself, who greenlit the developmental process of basically just a cannon that floats. It took decades of experimentation to be able to perfect the cannon itself, allowing it to even be fired without the weapon blowing itself apart due to the huge quantities of black powder required to hurl a projectile damn near the size of the ship itself at the enemy. And even today, after yet further decades of constant testing and refinement, there's still a very much so non-zero chance of the weapon simply exploding under the strain of repeated firing. And when it does explode, well, there's quite literally nothing left, except possibly a few pieces of flotsam that could be discovered on the water. That's about it. Oh, and sometimes a blown-off piece of an oarman discovered half a kilometer in the opposite direction. But despite the enormous dangers inherent in mounting a vast cast iron cannon on a boat, and the obvious problems with that it can only carry like 3 or 4 rounds to be fired and so on, not to mention the difficulties of reloading this thing on a constantly shifting ocean-going platform, oh boy. It is nevertheless considered a vital part of the Northern Fleet's abilities to discourage certain other races' primary warships, as in many cases even a full broadside from a great ship just simply isn't that much of a bother to many of the sleek and iron-wooded vessels of the enemy. A hellhammer, on the other hand, even a black ark is going to tread carefully around one of these things, and any normal vessel struck by it, well, to be entirely clear here, if you were to simply just place the cannonball onto the enemy vessel, not firing it, just dumping it on the vessel itself, that would be in many cases enough to sink smaller ships, never mind actually firing it at them. Now, of course, same as with the Iron Fist, actually hitting anything with the Hellhammer is extraordinarily difficult, as its primary means of aiming is 1, banks of oarsmen turning the ship around, and that's it. That's it. You point the vessel in the general direction of the enemy, and then you fire. There is virtually no other adjustment you can make other than adding or subtracting gunpowder. As unlike regular cannons that you can elevate or depress as required to change the angle of the weapon, this thing, yeah, you're not moving it. You are not moving it, so it has a very narrow, but also highly effective area of engagement. Obviously, though, these experimental warships make up a vanishingly small minority of the vessels employed by the Northern Fleet, whose main fighting ship is the Empire Wolfship. This again is a very large galleon-type vessel that can also operate within the shallower rivers of the River Reich, but it is equally adept at operating in the relatively shallow waters of the Empire's coastal regions, boasting a forward-facing ram to attack enemy vessels as it can be powered by banks of oarsmen and also sails. It can engage and destroy vessels by a solid strike, with the vessel's ram more than being capable of destroying most enemy ships. If, however, wind and weather is not on the side of the Wolfship, it possesses 2 large castles, one forward and one aft. Both of these castles boast a significant number of cannons of varying sizes that can be used to engage the enemy, mostly to clear the decks, as the Wolfship's barrage, with the exception of 2 larger forward-facing cannons firing down the bearing of the ram, are on the smaller side. But as the Wolfship's castles can also be used as elevated fighting platforms from which the enemy can be fired upon, this is not too much in the way of a restriction for the Wolfship, whose primary duty it is to either catch up to the vessel and then destroy them with superior firepower, or to outmaneuver them and ram them, as their primary prey are things like Norscan dragon ships or smaller raiders. And when there is larger prey to be pursued, such as the occasional Bretonnian corsair, for example, they operate in squadrons of 3 vessels, making sure that they can corner and run down any interlopers that have snuck into imperial waters. And quite a few Bretonnian corsairs as well, as in the modern age, coastal raids have gotten a lot rarer. The Empire is an enormous nation that is near constantly on a war footing. It is covered by garrisons, fortresses, and knightly orders, waging near constant war against beastmen, greenskins, chaos cults, the occasional Norscan war party wandering down through Kislev, etc. It is a rather hostile land for invaders. And so being able to launch coastal raids against what is already fortified cities, as no town in the Empire is unwalled and unfortified, at least not if it wishes to remain a town for more than a week or so. However, there are still plenty of merchant vessels plying the coast of the empire, up and down the ports from Marienburg to Kislev, for example, or seeking entry into the River Reich. Not to mention various other exotic merchants as well that come from faraway places like Astalia or Teleia, or even occasionally the elven parts of the world, or further still. For corsairs, therefore, the waters can still prove quite profitable. A fact that holds true for the Southern Navy as well, although on a smaller scale. See, whereas the Northern Navy is professional, well-drilled and trained, and employing only the finest seamen and the best military commanders, due to the simple fact that it's going to be required to fight some actual battles on occasion, against not just raiders, but straight-up foreign invasions, or potentially even worse things hitting the shores. The Southern Navy, however, predominantly only deals with smugglers and small-scale river pirates. We're talking goblins on wooden rafts, or the occasional Skaven sewer party that has figured out a way to build a small, rickety vessel. They are unlikely to run into much in the way of opposition beyond a particularly large boat, or even a particularly large raft, and so primarily employ smaller war galleys. In the rivers of the Empire, something like a wolf ship would be, if anything, a capital vessel. Brutal overkill against virtually anything and everything it can encounter. But that does not mean that the Southern Navy is any less prestigious than the Northern one. As, well, whilst the enemy may be somewhat less fierce, it is still of vital import to the Empire, perhaps even more so, frankly, that its waterways be kept open. It is through the arteries of the River Reich and its various tributaries that all of the food and trade of the internal empire flow, or at the very least a huge quantity of it. If this trade was to be interrupted, it would lead to serious economic consequences. Not to mention, of course, the trouble of moving troops easily throughout the empire, which often also relies on river barges and river travel. If there was ever to be a significant enemy presence operating on the River Reich, it would be a major headache for the Empire in its entirety. And preventing that from happening, therefore, is the key and core concern of the Southern Navy. Fact is, however, that does not happen very often. Rarely, if ever, in fact. And so most of the people assigned to the Southern Navy, at least in command positions, are foppish nobles. Second and third sons, whom their fathers still believe might have some hope left in them to serve their house, or at the very least give them an easy commission somewhere where they can't screw things up too much. Their main duties are participating in elaborate balls in Altdorf and entertaining young women with near purely fabricated tales of swashbuckling bravery on the rivers of the Empire. But whilst the command cadre may be somewhat rotten, the men actually are still of a fairly high caliber. See, a life in the Navy of the Empire is actually a pretty damn good one. You're guaranteed 2 to 3 meals a day. You're allowed to travel around the Empire and see it all. You're going to be engaging in virtually nothing but extraordinarily one-sided fights that you have practically zero chance of losing whatsoever. Little more than semi-nautical bullying, really. And you get paid on top of it all. Pretty nice wages as well, because whilst anyone can sign up to be one of the state troopers, in those cases you are little more than a permanent militia in essence. You are armed and you're given more training than your average peasant scum, to be sure, but a sailor is a specialist operative, possessed of actual knowledge required to operate a sailing vessel, and therefore valued significantly more highly than the average empire grunt. This also means that they will have a whole host of private enterprises waiting for them if they ever decide to leave the Empire's navy. They can serve aboard merchant vessels. They might even pick up a trade of their own, a private merchant endeavor, or they can serve in dozens of various supporting businesses along the waterfronts, the people making sails and ropes for naval vessels, perhaps even developing skills as a craftsman for the construction of the very warships upon which he once served. These surprisingly excellent conditions also deal with another problem that many navies have suffered throughout the years, particularly in our own history as well. See, during the height of the age of sail, becoming a sailor was pretty much a fucking death sentence. It was a bad job. Not only was it extraordinarily harsh and unpleasant, it was goddamn lethal. There were ample naval expeditions during the, say, 1700s, etc., especially before we figured out what scurvy was, where the crew would return home from an expedition with about 75% of the people aboard dead. It got so bad that the majority of the navies of the day couldn't really rely on volunteers or simply recruiting people. Instead, they would have to venture off onto the shores to press gang people. Now, press ganging, in case you're unaware of the term, literally means that a bunch of sailors would wander into a port and beat the ever-living shit out of whatever random individual they found, and then drag them back aboard their vessels, then tying them up beneath deck and venturing out to sea. By the time the poor unfortunate bastard awoke and were freed, they were so far out to sea that escape was impossible, and seeing as these warships would very rarely, if ever, return to a singular port for more than once every 3 or 4 years, you were just kinda stuck there. Meanwhile, returning to the world of Warhammer Fantasy, again, the serving conditions are actually rather excellent. You get to learn a trait, one that is highly valued in both civil and military circles. You receive plenty of food. There are very little, if any, real danger of diseases, as although the Empire Navy does on occasion launch expeditions out into the wild waters of the Warhammer world, things like expeditions to Lustria or even faraway Cathay or Nippon, these are very, very, very rare. And even then, your odds of surviving are significantly higher than a trip around the British Islands in the 1600s. All of this means that serving aboard an Empire warship is actually a pretty sweet gig. Well paid, relatively safe, and allows you to see the Empire. Something the majority of peasants could never even dream of. Thus, press ganging is a virtually unheard of phenomenon. Only used during times of extreme crises, when occasionally, due to disease or battles, the ships would otherwise be dangerously undermanned. And even then, they're supposed to only pick out people with previous naval experience. And if you're particularly good, or simply very lucky, you might even get to serve aboard one of the flagship vessels, the Greatships of the Empire. These vast vessels, with 2 decks of cannons, including massive castles both fore and aft, are the flagship vessels of high-ranking admirals, or sometimes even one of the Empire's 2 sea lords. They were originally constructed as a response to Bretonnia's galleons, and whilst they still do not boast quite the firepower of those vast vessels, they're not far behind, and if anything, they possess even better fighting position for the men aboard the ships. As with galleon-style vessels like this, the cannons were often very effective, to be sure, but sinking a wooden vessel with round shot is really goddamn difficult. And so more often than not, the vessels would heave up next to one another and then engage in a sort of close-range boarding action, with mariners firing against the opposition vessel using handguns, muskets, arrows, or crossbows from the forward or rear wooden castles or the fighting tops of the huge masts, giving, in essence, the advantage of elevation to the men fighting there. And since battles against equivalent vessels like Bretonnian galleys or various elf ships are extraordinarily rare indeed, the men serving aboard these vast warships really live a pretty pleasant life. After all, if chaos gets moving, it's probably going to be a major land invasion rather than anything the Navy is going to need to worry about. Sometimes the elves get uppity, and that is certainly uncomfortable. Sometimes the elves' very large ships get uppity, and that really does suck. But the Empire Navy has actually produced weapon systems specifically designed to deal with that very problem. Something Bretonnia is still struggling with, as they still remain rather distrustful of cannons. And if there was ever to be a truly enormous, large-scale naval invasion of the Empire, well, guess what? It's probably heading for the River Reich anyways, which means that's Marienburg's problem. Really, if you have to select any single old-world nation's military to serve in, make it the Empire's Navy. Your life will be very pleasant, bullying greenskins and other retarded little goblinoids, occasionally sinking an optimistic smuggling vessel, and getting 3 meals a day with only the occasional maggot in your biscuit. A damn near paradise-ish existence for the average imperial citizen anyways. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.